3, hit it!
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and welcome to today's Caffeine for the Soul. And today I wanted to share something that I find personally incredibly helpful, and I'm sharing it hoping that you will too. And I was thinking of how to get into this one. And what occurred to me is a story that I've heard a man named Chip Chipman tell a number of times. And Chip Chipman is one of the original teachers who worked with Syd Banks, who's the enlightened Scottish mystic whose work I'm continually quoting and pointing to in these podcasts. And when Syd was first enlightened and began teaching, people would gather around him, as they do often around enlightened teachers. But the thing that was different about Syd is he really was just a guy. Right? I've met people like this in my life who do extraordinary things, but if you meet them, you would never think they're somebody who does extraordinary things. And by all accounts, I never met Syd, but he was like that. He just was a very ordinary guy. And so Chip tells this story that early on in their work, they'd probably been for about a year, there'd been a group forming around Syd, and they lived on this island, Salt Spring Island in Canada. And so everyone went round to Syd's for a barbecue one Saturday, and Syd's flipping burgers in the back. And I love this image of an enlightened guy flipping burgers. I mean, I don't know, like most images people have of enlightened guys are these kind of gurus in robes. And I love the idea of just this guy flipping burgers in the back. But everyone was talking about thought. And they were talking about what they'd learned, and they were talking about, oh, well, yes, but I get really caught up in my thinking, and I need to find a way to get out of my thinking, and oh, yes, isn't it amazing how mind can solve all our problems, and how there's this, and at one point, Syd apparently just turned from the barbecue and goes, "Stop talking about this." And Chip was sort of shocked. He was like, "Stop talking about it, but isn't this the most important thing that we could be talking about?" And Syd said, "No. Go live your life. And then you'll see what you know. And what you know is what's going to inform how you live your life. You need to kind of get away from this conversation a little bit to see what you actually know." And when I now teach people the principles and how to work as coaches generally from an understanding of the principles, one of the things that I'm continually pointing them back to is, what do you know? Not what can you repeat that Syd said, what can you repeat that I said, what can you repeat that another teacher has said, but what do you just know for yourself? And the reason that's so important is because when you share what you know, it impacts people. When you share what you've heard, you know what? Everybody gets lucky sometimes. And there's something different about what you can authentically share about what has made a difference for you. Another favorite Syd story comes from George Pransky, one of my mentors, who used to spend a lot of time with Syd as well. And the very first time that George met Syd, he was the first professional psychologist who'd ever been out to hear Syd talk. And Syd was asking George, "Well, what do you do with clients?" And George said, "Well, we take them back into the past and we have them relive their traumas." And Syd said, "Oh gosh, that sounds awful. That sounds very painful." And George said, "Well, it is, but it by reliving their traumas, the idea is that that's gonna help them overcome them, and then they'll be able to get on with their lives." And Syd said, "Well, does it work?" And George, in telling the story, he says, well, his heart sank because no, it doesn't work for most people. But to kind of cover it over and bluster through it, he said, "Well, what would you do?" And Syd said, "Well, I'm not a therapist, but I suppose if somebody came to me who was suffering, I'd share with them what I'd seen in my own life that lets me cope with things really well, that lets me not suffer, that lets me have a happy life." And George, again, heart sinking, thinking, well, I don't really have a very happy life, said, "Well, Syd, there are some people in my profession who don't have happy lives. What would you suggest they do?" And Syd said something to the effect of, "I'd suggest that they learn how to have a happy life before they try to help other people who are miserable." And there's something so kind of common sense and obvious about that. that's also really heartening. So the question that I will often ask myself, ask other people is, what do you know? Not what do you think, not what do you think would be a good idea, not what have you heard that you think is cool, but heart of hearts, what do you know that makes your life easier? What do you know that makes your life better than it would be if you didn't know it? And the most recent time I asked myself that question, I got a very clear answer. And it's that I know that nobody does very well when they're stuck in their heads. Nobody does well when they overthink things. Now that may seem like a really simple thing to know, a really obvious thing even. And yet for me, knowing that just means I'm not inclined to do things that get me in my head. I'm not inclined to think things through for the 14th time so that maybe I'll get an even better idea than I had the first 13 times. I'm not interested in getting into conversations about how we're going to handle this and how we're going to handle that if they mean that I'm going to show up more in my head, with more on my mind, with more to think about. Because I just know I don't do very well. Nobody I know, nobody I've ever met does very well when they've got too much in their head, when they're stuck up in their head, when they're not available to life. My question for you is, what do you know? Heart of hearts, what do you know that makes your life a little bit better than it would be if you didn't know? And I really encourage you to take some time to reflect on that this week and see what you see. Because there's something about knowing what you know that's incredibly settling, that's incredibly powerful, and that if you work with others, becomes the heart of the work that you do. Have fun, learn heaps, and I'll talk with you soon.